We have Zizek in a debate with Sheldrake, proposing new words, um, elucidating his position on historicism, in which he's saying that the famous exclamation of Christ at the time of the Passion of Christ, Lord, Lord, why have thou forsaken me, is itself a standing, systematic, let's call it a paradigm, put sort of in deep parentheses, Agamben as the current preeminent thinker on the subject of paradigm. This paradigm then, or example of how we are meant to think of sheer opening rather than let us say daily doings, sheer opening to this which is for the tradition coming from the garden named after Academus, stands as behind philosophy. So, of course, the Socratic notion of thalmazine, or wonder, being behind philosophy is a kind of paradigm then in this sense. I don't think already one can say, at least according to Karl Jaspers, that Socrates, Plato, that amounts to the same thing. Slight difference. You have we have at least two major other authors, Aristophanes and Xenophon, giving testimony to the biographical really existing Socrates, but mainly when we talk about Socrates, it's indistinguishable from Plato because it's Socrates as written by Plato that we're talking about. But we have from Aristotle already apparently slightly different take on the origins of philosophy, and then we have something which in fact occurs in both of the plumb lines to the first to collect the congeries of different thoughts into philosophy as such, which is there's pre-Socratics, or according to Nietzsche, the pre-Platonics, including Socrates. They're all brought together. Plato thoroughly and passionately interrogates them, and then Aristotle treats Plato as an epigon of all who have come before, including the Pythagoreans, and interrogates that and comes up with a slightly different meaning. So in this sense, if we're to see what our potentialities are as thinkers, we need to look at the most simple accounts and see how they are not historical. So what does this mean, not historical? I tried to give, this is worth nothing unless it has a very quartz crystal clear simple concept behind it, which is what I'm trying to present here. In the most famous book of philosophy ever written, you get this saying by Thrasymachus, is saying, well, I'm going to tell you the answer to your question, Socrates, this huge question about what decay or justice is. But then immediately, because once you say something it becomes trivial, the genius of Plato has to show us This is how people really talk when such things of such essential import are said. So this definition of that dike or justice is the will of the stronger, which in a certain sense it's impossible to deny that this was the de facto truth of the time. So you look at in Aristotle, Book 10 of the Politics, you see this, that there's this gap between the Mycenaean period as broken down, the so-called Wanex, this figure that was both comprised, this kind of Dugan-like figure that, in my opinion, Dugan is higher than Putin. So there's a figure of the Wanex combines both Dugan and Putin, let's say, combines both the warlord and the religious figure, the guiding figure that shows us this is the direction we should go to, in the same way that when you're somewhere and you think, I'm going to go home, and you direct yourself towards home. How does that happen? It's elemental, and it's not exactly clear what's happening, but you know how to do it. So in this same way, the Wanex combined all in the Mycenaean period, say to 2000 BC, combined all the features, and then that broke down, and then you got a period of where it was de facto the case that the stronger decided what dike was, and in fact dike became a notion, became a concept, if you want to call it that, became an idea, became something that language captured because it was what was happening to Dasein during that period. So that dike is actually said in direct contradistinction to the period where there's no need for such a concept, the Mycenaean period. Once you have this situation, you get a split between the realist version and the attempt to improve upon it. So obviously the attempt to improve upon it, we still see in Olympiodorus, who gives the kind of quintessence of Plato in a few statements, but one of those statements is when the tyrant Dionysius at Syracuse in eastern Sicily attempting to get some flattering answer out of the young Plato, asked him, who is the happiest in Dinomia alive, which soul is the most excellent operating, and Plato says Socrates, insults Dionysius, and then he says, what is it that a statesman ought to be doing? And the answer is still the exact same thing. We're talking about like 500 AD, 800 years later. Whatever has happened in the intervening period, maybe this school founded in the Garden of Academus has broken down, come back, resurgences, different, Cicero has gone to school in Athens, etc., etc. Whatever has happened intervening, this same opinion that Socrates comes to, that dike is what improves the human being, meaning the citizens, more tangibly, of a polis. This view is still upheld in Olympiodorus, and it's part of the sort of essence of the Platonic school as it exists at the time when Justinian shuts it down. Again, in parentheses, anybody that's... some people have been asking about what does it mean, Roman lawyers, Roman jurists. The way to find out what that means is to go to something called Justinian's Digest. So that means it would take some people like Volapin, or however it should be pronounced, is some of these big Roman jurists, and all those texts are put together where that if you start reading that book, you can see, you will be pointed to the most important 4 or 5 Roman jurists, and through them to all the rest, if you're actually that interested in going into it. The subject is still of vital concern. Richard Epstein, the most powerful of the conservative jurists in America is a student of the Roman law, and so that's still vital even in the time when the most powerful legal organization, the SCOTUS, has become more or less naked in terms of being an organ of the political parties and only being stocked this way or that way with the so-called packing of the Supreme Court by the political agents. But if we think of that moment when this definition comes out, and then Thrasymachus says, well, okay, I've told you, are you going to give me the credit for it? Oh, I thought, don't I deserve some credit for saying the thing that's so enormous and vast truth here? So what can we do? In ordinary human life, there's nothing somebody could say that's so arresting that it simply puts a stop to life. Nietzsche has made this observation that it's a fluke that Socrates has been able to use this thing, dialectic discussion, out of discussion not even in a formal setting, but just about free people in what we now call civil society situation, has had so much power to determine the organs of political decision for human beings in a way that has not arisen in any other context. So that we get the situation where there's juries, Draco's system of law, the system where Plato's relative Solon comes in and makes the law into something which is responsible, responding to the general opinion of people, so much so that Aristotle, who's the most conservative, much more conservative than Plato and Socrates, not open to breaking down all these stuff, not open to really buckling with what investigation is. He says he goes with public opinion, which he, for the first time, gives this notion of the endoxa, which later in the Catholic period becomes known as the general opinion of mankind, and upheld as though, since human beings are in a certain sense the product of something eternal, we don't have to say, oh, it's merely empirical that somebody has this and this experience and this view of that experience. In other words, Thrasymachus has an experience of the polis of his day, Athens of his time. His experience is that that what is called dike, which we translate justice, is exactly what the powerful want it to be. That's his experience, that's his doxa. We translate it also more customarily as opinion, but opinion kind of misses that it's a living what happened to this person. They're saying the way it seems to them. So that something like that, which is very simple, seems to require a few people that are sensitive to it that can then deal with it. So in the same way, when we have this question of Zizek saying this whole issue is historical, just because the answer is very simple doesn't mean we should just leave it aside. We have to give weight to the things that are simple if we're to show that we have this sensitivity which allows us to buckle with this investigation, which is in a certain sense the thing which we need to give thorough and passionate attention to if we're to answer this Pseudo-Heideggerian question. So the problem with Zizek's view is that every time we go to the subject matter, we require a new interpretation. But Zizek's view is blocked out once you see that all of Hegel's thinking is dependent on the necessity to write the thing down. So you have a scientific proof, and then you have to write it down in a way that corresponds to the paradigm to keep it in place. The paradigm could be, for instance, that time ought to be considered in terms of the comparison of some physical operation, say the decay rate of a cesium atom compared to the movement, say, of the Earth around the Sun, so that you're making what you're really talking about is a comparison of two physical systems which are measurable, and this you're calling time. So you have a paradigm. So basically Hegel is locked into this present or Anwesen notion that when you're dealing with something you have under your control, and which is like the builder god, as sort of Plotinus brought out with the demiurge, you can put yourself only in the position of the demiurge. Then you have a scientific statement which is as if held in eternity, because you're always holding it in that paradigm, but you're always thereby leaving out the observer, as it were, so that the paradigm becomes an object of the observer, and you have this notion of presence or availability to that object or observer. And so long as you're doing that, then you're not conscious of the problem, the region of problems which Heidegger is trying to overcome. Because by Dasein, as Agamben says, we're just talking about an opening. We're not talking about the possession of some paradigm by a subject, as it were. Or we're not talking about something that's complex in that sense. Heidegger does make something. So I'll try to show how Heidegger is operating. Heidegger does continuously point to things, but he does it knowing that he's continuously in this Geworfenheit, which Zizek is drawn into the strong gravity of, the heavy gravity of. So Zizek is sort of, because as said, by super transcendentalism, I mean to think of the Heideggerian Geworfenheit, the thrownness. So, but think of what the thrownness actually means. It means that the Thelmasein, or the wonder, as it's been customarily translated in English, is not wonder or Thelmasein for Heidegger. So he looks at the Antigone, for instance, and he translates some sentence where it says something about da 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 Thelmasein, da 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 da. What's the word for man and the human being? Not man, but human being in Greek, anthropos. So something Thelmasein, something anthropos, and he says instead he plugs in, because he's living in the technological essence, it's in a way appropriate to put it that way, he plugs in unheimlich. So instead of Thelmasein, unheimlich, man is the most wondering being, the being that wonders. This is essencing in man, but instead it's. I once heard a native, somebody who had for their Muttersprache Deutsch, German, say when they heard the word Thelmasein, they said Thelmasein means weird, but not in a bad way. So, but it's sometimes translated as creepy, but it's more often translated as uncanny, as in the Freudian uncanny valley concept. And in Heidegger, the interpreters of Heidegger are always translating it as uncanny, but I think, which is, I don't take particular issue with, but I only would point out that it seems to me if you go to Akira Kurosawa's Macbeth, then you see that it's a kind of a ghost without feet floating in the forest that Toshiro Mifune and his the soldier he's with in the forest come across. This is like the Vorfenheit. This is like the Akira Kurosawa comes across this. He's thrown into this idea of the weird sisters in Macbeth and Shakespeare, and this is what he does with it, because ghosts in Japan don't have feet, or ghosts in Japan have a certain character that's a ghost to be haunted by something means in a Japanese context. And in the same way, in the sort of late Prussian, in the sort of post state of intelligence, so far as Prussia in the generation after Goethe was sort of dubbed as the state of the intellect, or the state of Geist, or of mind, something like that. Remember, you have sort of Kant dies, a couple of years later Faust comes out, Goethe's like 20 years younger or so, and then you have another generation comes and they say Prussia is this world of where intelligence is the crucial thing. In parentheses, I mentioned, this in about 1956 or so, Jaspers and Arendt having this conversation where Arendt says it's impossible to convey even a soupçon of sense to the Americans about what philosophy means, because the Americans only understand politics. In this moment, when a very specific understanding of the essence of human society, of Prussian society, as the state which is most interested in this, not in anything I mentioned in passing. I think I'd do something else on it, on this akademische Freiheit, academic freedom. It has nothing to do with academic freedom. It has to do rather with the sense that we now have turned the combination lock back and forth in just the right super subtle manner, and we're going in the right direction, and this is how we should go. So if you don't like that direction, you would say this is total censorship and everything terrible. But if you do like it, then you would think this is freedom, because we're free to pursue the thing that's the highest thing, and the thing which we have this this urge towards this. That's the Aristotelian term. It's I can't remember. It's onexus or nexus or something like that. But this is sheer urge towards this thing which we in a certain way understand. So in the Zizek version, you still see this question placed in a dogmatic terms of the Athenians. So, for instance, I think Agamben is sort of the best living scholar on the concept of will. He points to some earlier people like Jean-Pierre Vernant, the French classicist, who shows that amongst the Greeks there was not really anything like what Descartes and Spinoza has meant by will. There was belesis or belay or something like deliberation. It had I think it had originally a different meaning in the common tongue, but it became to mean deliberation meaning in the proper sense, coming to a decision, right? And on the other side, this I forget what the right term, or nexus, or however it's called. It's just urge towards something, and I think Aristotle has dealt with these things extensively, to the extent where he shows, you can't just have one or the other. I think in on the soul, for instance. He goes into that. You can't just have sort of a willing towards something, and you can't just have on the other hand, the end point of the liberation, because either way you don't quite get to what causes the next moment to turn and to become. So Zizek is still operating as though those categories that were already in Aristotle are fixed and eternal, but when you kind of look at them and keep reinterpreting them and realize that you can't even place them in time unless you absolutely insist that the true sense of time is this comparison sense of the cesium atom and the earth going around the world, or any other such comparison of physical systems. When you see that the sense of how we understand time, the usage of the word time can change, all these things can change. You see why Heidegger is saying we have to keep this whirling up of the investigation has to be held to, but we have to keep doing it again and again and again and again every time we step out, which is what I've been saying even quite earlier. I felt locked into this sense of Heidegger as someone who, the reason he keeps going on in his investigations is because he thinks maybe he could reach the truth of being. He has to keep, it's not that he has something fixed like a paradigm, as we were just discussing, and then he wants to stay constant with that. It's rather, I'll put it this way, it's sort of like if you look at Hegel, and you compare Hegel to Nietzsche, you see in Hegel there's a tendency to try to nail things down to the paradigm or to the so-called system, and not be just drawn away by the historical consciousness, as Nietzsche in Strauss's version is most famous for. But in Nietzsche, then you get the opposite, this hyper-awareness that everything I just said, everything is breaking down, everything is always subject to a new appraisal, so that Thalmazein gets understood as unheimlich, gets understood as wonder, gets understood as creepy, gets understood as weird but not in a bad way, etc., etc. So you have these two poles, and then Heidegger seems to try to hold with this so-called steadfast resolution to a course which must, outstrip historicism and actualism, outstrip the two positions, and achieve a certain radicality of opening which is unknown to all thought hitherto.